Indonesia's Finance Minister Purbaya Sadua recently made waves at a seminar in Jakarta. He floated a bold idea that caught the attention of global markets and policymakers alike. He suggested that Indonesia could start collecting transit fees from ships passing through the Strait of Malacca. This was directly inspired by Iran's controversial decision to impose tolls on vessels traversing the Strait of Hormuz. The minister's remarks were delivered in a characteristically blunt manner. They reflected President Prabowo Subianto's broader vision of transforming Indonesia from what he calls a peripheral nation into a central player on the global economic stage. The Malacca Strait is one of the most critical shipping lanes on the planet. It connects the Indian Ocean to the Pacific and handles roughly 30% of all global maritime trade. 200 ships pass through it every single day, making it twice as busy as the Strait of Hormuz. The timing of this proposal could not be more significant. The world is still reeling from the shockwaves created by Iran's decision to start charging fees for ships passing through Hormuz. This followed the outbreak of war between Tehran and the United States and Israel. That conflict, now in its 8th week, has fundamentally altered the calculus around freedom of navigation in international waters. Iran has already announced that it has begun receiving revenue from these transit fees. Remarkably, U.S. President Donald Trump has at times signaled his comfort with the arrangement. He even suggested that America and Iran could jointly manage the waterway as part of a post-war settlement. This precedent has emboldened other nations, sitting on strategic choke points, to reconsider their own positions. Indonesia appears to be testing those waters carefully. The economic potential is undeniably massive. Purbaya pointed out that if Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore were to split the revenue 3 ways, the amount could be quite substantial. Indonesia's stretch of the Malacca Strait is the largest and longest among the 3 littoral states. This gives it the strongest claim to the lion's share of any potential fees. The minister emphasized that Indonesia controls the biggest chunk of the passageway. With all the natural resources the archipelago possesses, the country should not be thinking defensively. Rather, it should think offensively in a measured way. He framed the current situation as one where ships pass through Indonesian waters without contributing anything to the nation's coffers. He questioned whether that arrangement truly serves the country's long-term interests. However, the reaction from Indonesia's neighbors was swift and largely negative. This showed the diplomatic complexity of such a move. Singapore's Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan wasted no time in making his country's position crystal clear. He stated emphatically that the right of transit passage is guaranteed for everyone under international law. Singapore would not participate in any attempts to close, interdict, or impose tolls in the neighborhood. For Singapore, this is not merely a diplomatic stance but an existential economic issue. It strikes at the very heart of its prosperity. The city-state is the world's largest transshipment and bunkering hub. Over 130,000 vessels call at its ports annually. Any restriction on free passage through Malacca would be devastating. Malaysia's response was more measured but equally firm. Foreign Minister Muhammad Hassan warned that anything done in the waterway must involve cooperation of all 4 bordering countries. This includes Thailand alongside Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. He stressed that it cannot be done unilaterally. This reflects the delicate balance of interests that has governed the strait for decades. Malaysia's Transport Minister Anthony Loke separately reaffirmed his country's commitment. He emphasized Malaysia's role as a council member of the International Maritime Organization. He dedicated his stance to a rules-based system where all members respect international law without exception. The legal framework governing this issue is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, known as UNCLOS. This decades-old international maritime law is absolutely clear on the matter. Any toll for passage through natural straits used for international navigation would be illegal. The Straits of Malacca and Singapore for May. Continuous waterway that qualifies as a strait to be used for international navigation. This triggers the right of transit passage. Under UNCLOS, bordering states are legally obliged not to hamper transit passage. There shall be no suspension of transit passage under any circumstances. A toll would have the practical effect of hampering that right. The convention expressly prohibits charges on foreign ships simply for passing through. This is where the situation becomes particularly delicate for Indonesia. UNCLOS is not some abstract legal document for Jakarta. It is the very foundation of Indonesia's modern territorial integrity. The archipelagic state concept enshrined in UNCLOS gave Indonesia sovereignty over all waters enclosed within its archipelagic baselines. This includes natural resources within them. It established its 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. In concrete terms, UNCLOS transformed what was essentially a collection of islands into a unified archipelagic state. It granted Indonesia more than 3 million square kilometers of archipelagic and internal waters. It also granted nearly 300,000 square kilometers of territorial sea. For Indonesia to even flirt with violating UNCLOS would be dangerous. As one analyst put it, it would be like sawing off the very legal branch it sits on. The 3 littoral states have long honored these obligations in practice through careful diplomacy. They have managed the straits through the Tripartite Technical Experts Group since 1971. A unilateral levy would undermine exactly this cooperative framework. This framework took decades of careful diplomacy to build. Indonesian Foreign Minister Sujono was quick to walk back the finance minister's remarks. He clarified that there were no plans for a Malacca levy. He emphasized that Indonesia must respect international law. He stated that as a trading nation, Indonesia supports freedom of navigation. He believes in creating a free, neutral, and mutually supportive shipping lane. The global implications of this debate extend far beyond Southeast Asia. The Strait of Malacca carries almost 22% of the world's maritime trade. Any disruption would send shockwaves through global supply chains everywhere. China, in particular, is heavily dependent on this waterway for its energy security. Roughly 80% of China's oil imports pass through the Malacca Strait. This is what strategists call the Malacca Dilemma. It represents China's critical vulnerability to any disruption in this choke point. The idea of a transit fee adds another layer of uncertainty. China's manufacturing sector would feel the pinch almost immediately. The country is the world's factory, producing everything from electronics to solar panels. Any increase in shipping costs would inevitably be passed down to consumers. This would drive up prices for Chinese-made goods across the globe. Chinese companies have already been exploring the China Plus One strategy. They are diversifying manufacturing bases to countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia itself. This reduces dependence on a single production hub. A Malacca toll would only accelerate this trend. It could hurt China's economic growth at a time when it already faces headwinds from the trade war with the United States. The impact on global inflation cannot be overstated. Higher shipping costs translate directly into higher prices for everything. This includes gasoline at the pump and groceries on store shelves. The world is still recovering from inflationary pressures of the past few years. Any new shock to supply chains could reignite price pressures. Central banks have been struggling to contain inflation. Oil prices would likely spike as the cost of transporting crude rises. Petrol would become more expensive. Diesel would follow suit. The ripple effects would cascade through transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture sectors worldwide. No country would be immune from these effects. Pakistan and Afghanistan find themselves in an interesting position amid all this maneuvering. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor connects China's western regions to Pakistan's Gwadar port. It was partly designed to bypass the Malacca Strait altogether. If transit through Malacca becomes more expensive, the strategic value of this corridor increases dramatically. Pakistan could position itself as an alternative route for Chinese goods. These goods head to the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Afghanistan, too, stands to benefit if regional connectivity projects gain renewed urgency. Countries seek to diversify their trade routes away from potentially troubled waters. This could reshape regional economic geography. Iran's actions in the Strait of Hormuz have created a template that other nations are studying carefully. Tehran has tightened its grip on the waterway following the US-Israeli attacks on its capital. Parts of the shipping lane are located in Iranian territorial waters. This enables Tehran to control traffic in ways that Indonesia cannot easily replicate. Iran has announced that it received its first revenue from transit fees. Payments are reportedly being made in Chinese yuan or cryptocurrencies. This helps circumvent Western sanctions. Some countries have secured safe transit through Hormuz after negotiations with Iran. These include India, Thailand, and Pakistan. Singapore has steadfastly refused to negotiate. It calls Tehran's closure of the waterway a violation of international law. The contrast between Iran's situation and Indonesia's is instructive. Iran's toll proposal emerged from an active international armed conflict. It was not from a peacetime revenue strategy. For Indonesia to look at that scenario and see a revenue opportunity is fundamentally flawed. This is true from both a legal and strategic perspective. Following Iran's wartime example would introduce instability. This is precisely the kind of instability that makes the Malacca Strait economically valuable. If ships cannot count on free passage, they may seek alternative routes. They could potentially bypass Indonesian waters altogether. The Lombok and Sunda Straits, also controlled by Indonesia, could see increased traffic, but these routes are longer and more expensive. Any gains from a Malacca toll could be offset by losses elsewhere. In the archipelago, this is a risk that Jakarta must carefully consider. Thailand is watching these developments with particular interest. On April 20th, Thai Deputy Prime Minister Phiphat Ratchakitprakarn made an announcement. He said the country would fast-track a plan to build a land bridge. This would connect the Strait of Malacca and the Gulf of Thailand. The massive infrastructure project would cost 1 trillion Thai baht. This is roughly $31 billion. It would link seaports on either side of the country through road and rail networks. The land bridge could cut transit time by 4 days. It could reduce shipping costs by 15%. This offers a viable alternative to the uncertain maritime route through Malacca. Thailand has long floated the idea of building a canal across the Isthmus. This is the narrowest part of the Malay Peninsula, but the astronomical costs have always made it a non-starter. The land bridge represents a more practical compromise for Bangkok. It shows how regional players are adapting to new uncertainties. The role of the United States in all of this is complex and somewhat contradictory. President Trump has at times endorsed the idea of Iran collecting tolls in Hormuz. He even suggested joint US-Iran management of the waterway. This represents a dramatic departure from decades of American foreign policy. That policy has consistently emphasized freedom of navigation. If the United States is willing to accept tolls in Hormuz, it becomes harder to oppose similar moves in Malacca. At the same time, any disruption in Malacca would directly impact American economic interests. The U.S. is a major trading partner for countries on both sides of the Pacific. This creates a difficult balancing act for Washington. Australia has also weighed in on the debate with strong words. Defense Minister Richard Marles stated Australia's complete commitment to UNCLOS. He emphasized freedom of navigation and the broader rules-based order. For Australia, sea lines of communication are profoundly important. The country derives a growing proportion of its national income from trade. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese spoke with Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto. This was just before Purbia's comments. It is unclear whether the topic came up in their conversation. Australian analysts have warned that Indonesia's willingness to toy with this idea is worrying. This is especially concerning given Indonesia's dependence on UNCLOS. The broader lesson here is about the fragility of the rules-based international order. This order is not a natural condition of the world. It is a political achievement constructed through decades of negotiation and compromise. UNCLOS itself took 9 years of negotiations. States agreed to constrain their own sovereign impulses. They recognized that the resulting framework served their long-term interests better. The alternative is a world governed by power alone. In such a world, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. That order is under more strain today than at any point since the post-war institutions were built. When states begin selectively defecting from rules they collectively agreed to, the edifice erodes quietly. It happens precedent by precedent until the rules no longer rule. For smaller and middle power states, this erosion is particularly dangerous. What protection do they have, if not the rule of law? This is a question that should concern us all. Indonesia is not a small state, but it is not a superpower either. Its ability to enforce a unilateral toll in Malacca would depend on powerful actors. Those actors include China and the United States. If those powers decided to challenge such a move, Indonesia would be in a very difficult position. The consequences could be severe. Any Indonesian attempt to collect tolls would likely be met with retaliatory measures. These could include trade restrictions or even military posturing. This would happen in waters that Indonesia considers its own. But these waters are governed by international treaties. This creates a dangerous mismatch between ambition and capability. The domestic political context in Indonesia also matters significantly. President Prabowo Subianto has made his intentions clear. He wants Indonesia to punch above its weight on the global stage. He has publicly pointed out that 70% of Asia's trade travels through Indonesian straits. These include Lombok, Sunda, and Malacca. This is part of a broader narrative about Indonesia's rightful place in the world. It is about moving from the margins to the center of global affairs. The finance minister's remarks align with this vision. They were delivered in a somewhat lighthearted tone. Purbia himself acknowledged the difficulty of implementation. He said if only it could be like that, but that's not the case. Yet the fact that such an idea is being voiced at the highest levels is significant. It signals a shift in thinking that cannot be entirely dismissed by observers. The world should pay close attention to these signals from Jakarta. China's response to all of this has been characteristically cautious but calculating. Beijing is heavily invested in maintaining free passage through Malacca, but it is also watching how the international community responds to Iran's actions in Hormuz. If the world largely accepts Iran's tolls, China may have less leverage to oppose similar moves elsewhere. At the same time, China has been investing heavily in alternative routes. These include the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. There are also various overland rail connections through Central Asia. These projects are expensive and face numerous challenges, but they represent Beijing's long-term strategy to reduce vulnerability to maritime choke points. The energy implications are particularly stark for the Chinese economy. China is the world's largest importer of oil. The vast majority of those imports come from the Middle East and Africa. They pass through the Indian Ocean and the Malacca Strait. Any increase in transit costs would directly impact China's energy security. It would also affect its economic competitiveness. Chinese refineries would face higher input costs. These would be passed on to consumers in the form of higher fuel prices. Industries that are energy-intensive would see their costs rise. These include steel, aluminum, and chemicals. This could make Chinese exports less competitive on global markets. This is precisely why the Malacca dilemma has been a central concern for Chinese strategic planners. They have been working tirelessly to find alternatives. For the average consumer around the world, the consequences would be felt in the wallet. Gasoline prices would rise, making commuting more expensive. Shipping costs for online purchases would increase. The cost of moving goods from factories in Asia to markets in Europe and America would go up. Food prices would climb as transportation costs increase. Inflation would get another unwelcome boost. The poorest households would be hit hardest. They spend a larger proportion of their income on basic necessities like food and fuel. This is why the debate matters to ordinary people everywhere. It is not just for policymakers and analysts to worry about. Indonesia's own economic interests may not be well served by a toll. This is true despite the apparent revenue potential. The country is a major trading nation. Its own exports and imports depend on free passage through the very waters it is considering taxing. Indonesian palm oil, coal, nickel, and other commodities must reach global markets. Indonesian consumers rely on imported goods that pass through Malacca. A toll that raises costs for everyone would raise costs for Indonesia too. Moreover, Indonesia's reputation as a reliable partner in global trade could suffer. This could discourage foreign investment at a time when Jakarta is actively seeking more capital. The cooperative framework that has governed the Malacca Strait for over half a century is remarkable. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore have put aside their differences. They have worked together to ensure safe and efficient passage for thousands of ships each year. This cooperation has benefited all three countries. It has also benefited the broader global economy. Undermining this framework for short-term revenue would be foolish. It would be cutting off one's nose to spite one's face. The long-term costs would almost certainly outweigh any short-term financial benefits. These costs include damaged relationships, legal challenges, and potential retaliation. Wise leadership requires seeing beyond immediate gains to the bigger picture. The international media coverage has been extensive and somewhat alarmist. Headlines have suggested that Indonesia is planning to impose tolls imminently. This is not accurate. The finance minister's remarks were exploratory and conditional. The foreign minister's swift clarification makes it clear that no such policy is under serious consideration. But the fact that the idea is being discussed at all is significant. It reflects a broader trend of nations reassessing their strategic assets. They are looking for ways to monetize their geographical advantages. This is happening in an increasingly competitive world. Whether this leads to a more fragmented international order or merely represents rhetorical positioning remains to be seen. For now, the Strait of Malacca remains open and free. It has been this way for generations. Ships continue to pass through in their hundreds every day. They carry the goods that power the global economy. The legal framework that guarantees this freedom remains intact. The cooperative mechanisms continue to function effectively. But the debate sparked by Indonesia's finance minister serves as a reminder. Nothing in international relations is permanent. The rules and norms that we take for granted are the product of political choices. They can be undone by political choices too. The question is whether nations have the wisdom to maintain what has served them. Well, the coming months will be crucial in determining the trajectory of this issue. If Iran's toll collection in Hormuz becomes normalized, pressure on Indonesia will increase. If Iran's actions are successfully challenged, the precedent will be less compelling. Much depends on how major powers navigate the complex diplomatic and legal terrain. For Indonesia, the challenge is to pursue legitimate economic interests without undermining the frameworks that made those interests possible. It is a delicate balance. It will require skillful diplomacy and a clear-eyed understanding of both opportunities and risks. The world is watching closely. In the end, the Malacca Strait toll debate is about much more than money. It is about the kind of world we want to live in. Do we want one governed by rules and cooperation, or one governed by power and opportunism? The choice that Indonesia and its neighbors make will have far-reaching implications. It will shape the future of global trade and international law. It will affect the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific for years to come. The world is watching the decisions made in Jakarta, Singapore, and Kuala Lumpur. They will send a powerful signal about the direction of the international order. Will it be toward greater cooperation and respect for law? Or will it be toward fragmentation and transactional relationships? The answer will affect us all in profound ways.